It's a lonely image, the billionaire in the dark tower. But let's pivot from the lonely billionaire to a man who was never lonely because he was surrounded by thousands of pigeons. Let's talk about Nikola Tesla. Tesla fits our theme perfectly. Genius, eccentric, and a personal life that makes you go, wait, what? Tesla invented the alternating current, AC, motor. He essentially built the 20th century, but he died penniless in a New York hotel room. Tesla had specific tastes. He hated pearls. If a woman was wearing pearl jewelry, he couldn't talk to her. He would send his secretary home if she wore pearls. He also hated round objects in general. And he had a thing about the number 3. He would walk around a building 3 times before entering. He would ask for 18 napkins, divisible by 3, to polish his silverware before every meal. But his true love, and I mean true love, was a pigeon. He lived at the Hotel New Yorker. He spent his days feeding pigeons in the park. If one was sick, he would bring it back to his hotel room. He turned his suite into a pigeon hospital. Can you imagine being the maid? "Mr. Tesla, there are feathers everywhere. Do not disturb the patients." There was one specific pigeon, a white female with gray tips on her wings. Tesla wrote about her in his diary, and the language he used, well, it's romantic. "I loved that pigeon as a man loves a woman, and she loved me. As long as I had her, there was a purpose to my life." He claimed that one night the pigeon flew into his room through an open window. She stood on his desk. He said a light came from her eyes, a powerful beam of light, and then she died. And he knew in that moment that his life's work was finished. It's easy to laugh at. The electric wizard loved a bird. But it's also kind of beautiful in a sad, strange way. Here was a man whose mind was vibrating on a frequency nobody else could hear. He understood electricity, lightning, radio waves. But people? People were confusing. People wore pearls and stole his patents. Pigeons were simple. Pigeons were loyal. Let's leave Tesla and his birds on the window ledge of the Hotel New Yorker. The city lights are twinkling below. It's raining softly. Let's drift back in time again. We've done the 20th century. Let's go back to the Middle Ages, the era of stone castles and iron armor. But we're not going to talk about knights. We're going to talk about a specific type of royal pet, the court dwarf. Now, the term is outdated and offensive today, but historically, this was a specific job title. Royals collected curiosities, and unfortunately, that included people. But it wasn't always a story of victimhood. Some of these individuals were incredibly powerful. They were the only ones allowed to tell the king the truth. Let's talk about Sir Geoffrey Hudson, Lord Minimus. Geoffrey was born in 1919. He was perfectly proportioned, but tiny. At age 7, he was 18 inches tall. He was presented to Queen Henrietta Maria, wife of our headless friend Charles I, in a pie. Yes, a pie. They held a banquet. The servants brought out a massive crust. The music stopped. The crust broke open, and out popped Geoffrey, dressed in a tiny suit of armor. The queen was delighted. He became her favorite companion. But Geoffrey wasn't just a toy. He was a tough guy. He carried pistols. He rode a horse. During the Civil War, he became a captain of horse. When the queen fled to France, Geoffrey went with her. In France, the brother of a Crofts horsemaster made fun of him. He insulted Geoffrey one too many times. Geoffrey challenged him to a duel. The guy laughed. He showed up to the duel with a water squirt gun, thinking it was a joke. Geoffrey was not joking. Geoffrey showed up with a real pistol, rode his horse at full gallop, and shot the man dead through the forehead. Lesson learned, do not bring a squirt gun to a duel with a man who stepped out of a pie. We'll explore what happened to Geoffrey after the duel, because it involves pirates, obviously, in just a moment. The pirate dwarf, the dentist czar, and the moose who drank beer.
So we left Sir Geoffrey Hudson standing over his opponent, smoking a pistol in his hand. He had just won the duel. He had proven that being 18 inches tall didn't mean you couldn't defend your honor. You'd think this would be the moment he earned everyone's respect. But this was the 17th century court. Killing a man, even in a duel, was still technically illegal if the queen didn't approve of it, and she was not amused. She exiled him. Poor Geoffrey. He went from being the queen's favorite pie filling to a man on the run. He got on a ship to return to England, but his bad luck was just getting started. The ship was captured by Barbary pirates. Now, usually when we think of pirates, we think of Johnny Depp or treasure chests. We don't think of the sheer administrative boredom of being a captive. Geoffrey was taken to North Africa and spent the next 25 years as a slave. We don't know exactly what he did, probably labor that was too heavy for him. It was a hard life. But here is the strangest part of Geoffrey's story, the part that medical science still scratches its head over. When he was captured, he was 30 years old and 18 inches tall. He had been that height since he was 7. He had stopped growing. But during his time in captivity, during the stress, the poor food, the hard labor, he started growing again. When he was finally ransomed and returned to England in his 50s, he was 45 inches tall. He had nearly doubled his height. Late onset growth spurt? A reaction to the change in environment? We don't know, but he came back a different man. He was no longer the tiny, doll-like figure the court remembered. He was a weather-beaten, slightly taller veteran of a hard life. He died in obscurity, but he lived a life bigger than most giants. Speaking of giants, let's float east again, to Russia, to the court of a man who was physically huge and personally terrifying, Peter the Great. Peter was 6 feet 8. In the early 1400s, the average height was much lower, so Peter was essentially a skyscraper walking among cottages. He was a man of boundless energy. He wanted to drag Russia into the modern world, whether Russia wanted to or not. He built St. Petersburg on a swamp. He forced the boyars, nobles, to shave their long traditional beards. If they refused, he would pin them down and shave them himself, or he would tax the beard. You had to carry a beard token, a coin that said, "The beard is a useless burden," to prove you had paid for the privilege of having facial hair. But his true love, and I mean true love, was dentistry. Peter lived himself a bit of a Renaissance man. He learned shipbuilding, carpentry, and anatomy, and he decided, with zero medical training, that he was an excellent dentist. He carried a little bag with him everywhere. It contained his instruments. If a courtier complained of a toothache, Peter's eyes would light up. "Oh, does it hurt? Let me see."
Someone really, really high, you know that detached is an accurate description. They are physically present, but mentally they are floating somewhere in the stratosphere, contemplating the texture of a rock. But of course, not everyone was happy about it. Throughout history, there's always a buzzkill, usually a colonial administrator or a particularly stiff religious reformer. But in ancient India, the integration was so deep that it was hard to root out. It was social, it was religious, it was medicinal. It was the thing you offered guests during festivals like Holi. Happy Spring Festival, please have this green milk and try not to fall into the bonfire. Now, let's drift west again, moving through time, towards the Middle East and the rise of Islam. The Quran explicitly forbids alcohol. Khamr, the intoxicating drink, is a no-go. But cannabis? That was a bit of a gray area. It wasn't explicitly mentioned in the Holy Book, mostly because the Prophet lived in a region where date wine was the main vice, not Central Asian herbs. So, for centuries, Islamic scholars had to debate, is hashish like wine? Some said yes, absolutely, it intoxicates you, therefore it is haram. Others said, well, it's not a liquid, and it doesn't make you violent like a drunk person, it just makes you hungry and quiet, so maybe it's fine? This loophole allowed hashish, which is the resin of the plant, to become incredibly popular across the Islamic world from the 9th century onwards. It was the poor man's pleasure. Wine was expensive and forbidden. Hashish was cheap, grew everywhere, and you could technically argue with a cleric about whether it was allowed. This brings us to one of the most misunderstood groups in history, the assassins, or the Hashishin. You've probably heard the story, a secret order of killers in the mountains of Persia led by a mysterious old man of the mountain. The legend, popularized by Marco Polo, who, like Herodotus, was a fantastic liar, claims that the leader would drug his young warriors with hashish. He would knock them out, drag them into a beautiful garden filled with food and women, and let them wake up. He'd tell them, "This is paradise, and if you go jump off a cliff for me or kill that politician I don't like, you'll come back here forever." It's a great story. It has everything: drugs, brainwashing, secret gardens, murder. The only problem is that it's almost certainly nonsense. The term hashishin was likely used as a derogatory slur by their enemies. Calling them potheads was a way to delegitimize them. All those guys, don't worry about them. They're just high on hashish. They don't know what they're doing. In reality, the Nizari Ismailis, the actual name of the group, were a sophisticated political and religious faction. They were outnumbered, so they used targeted assassination as a survival strategy. It was tactical, not drug-fueled. A guy stoned out of his mind is generally not the best candidate for a precision stealth mission. He's more likely to get distracted by a tapestry or forget where he put his dagger. But the name stuck. Hashishin eventually morphed into the word assassin. So every time you use that word, you are technically referencing a medieval smear campaign about weed. As we slide into the medieval period, the plant continues its silent, smoky conquest of the globe. It moves into Africa, where it was embraced with enthusiasm. It moves into Europe, but mostly as rope. The Europeans were obsessed with hemp, but almost entirely for naval reasons. You need sails, you need rigging. A standard ship required tons of hemp. Queen Elizabeth I actually fined farmers who didn't grow hemp. Can you imagine a government mandate forcing you to grow weed? Granted, it was the non-psychoactive kind, and you had to turn it into rope for the Navy, which is hard work and not very relaxing. But still, if you were a farmer in Tudor England and you said, "No, I'd rather grow wheat," the Queen would slap you with a fine. "Plant the hemp, peasant. We have an armada to defeat." There are rumors, always unproven, about Shakespeare. Some people found some clay pipes in his garden in Stratford-upon-Avon a few years back. They tested the residue. Some of them had traces of nicotine. Some had traces of cannabis. Does this mean the bard was writing Hamlet while high? To be or not to be? Wait, what was the question? It's fun to speculate. It would explain some of the weirder plot twists in his late plays. The Tempest is basically a hallucination on an island anyway. But generally, Europe was late to the party when it came to smoking it. They were too busy drinking ale and gin. It wasn't until Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798 that the French really discovered hashish. Napoleon's soldiers arrived in Egypt, realized there was no wine because it was a Muslim country, and panicked. How are we supposed to conquer without wine? Then they found the hashish shops. The soldiers took to it immediately. They brought the habit back to France, sparking a bizarre intellectual movement in Paris in the mid-19th century called the Club des Hachishines, the Club of the Hashish Eaters. This was a group of writers and artists, Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas, Baudelaire, who would get together in a fancy hotel, dress up in oriental costumes, and eat globs of green paste. They treated it like a seance. They would eat the paste and then sit around waiting for visions. Baudelaire wrote extensively about it. He described it as a slow suicide, which is very French and dramatic. He hated it, but he kept doing it, which is also very French. He complained that it made him lazy and destroyed his will. "I cannot write poetry, I can only stare at the wallpaper." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Americans were growing hemp like crazy. George Washington grew it. Thomas Jefferson grew it. Again, mostly for fiber, but there's a diary entry from Washington where he laments that he separated the male and female plants too late. If you know anything about botany, you know that separating the plants is how you prevent them from going to seed, which increases the potency of the flower. Was George trying to make high-grade sinsemilla at Mount Vernon? Probably not.
He probably just wanted better fiber, but the image of the father of the country fussing over his weed plants is a delightful one to hold on to as you drift off. It wasn't until the early 20th century that the mood shifted, and it shifted hard. But that is a story of politics and racism and bureaucracy, which is far too stressful for right now. We prefer the era of the transparent emperor and the giggling Scythians. Let's leave the smoke clearing in the air for a moment. Let it dissipate. We're going to pivot now. We're going to leave the world of botany and step into the world of biology, specifically the biology of people who really should not have married their cousins. That's right, we are going to talk about the Habsburgs, the jaw, the chin, and the family tree that was a wreath. If cannabis is nature's way of saying chill out, the Habsburg dynasty is nature's way of saying, please, for the love of God, meet new people. You cannot talk about European history without talking about the Habsburgs. They were the ultimate power couple, except the couple was usually an uncle and a niece. For centuries, they ruled everything: Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, half of the New World. They were everywhere, and they wanted to keep it that way. Their family motto was essentially, why marry a stranger when you can marry someone who looks exactly like you? This strategy worked great for consolidating land titles. It worked significantly less well for their DNA. We have to start with Carlos II of Spain. Poor Carlos. He is the end of the line, literally and genetically. He's the tragic punchline to centuries of strategic inbreeding. When he was born in 1661, the Spanish court was thrilled. A male heir! The dynasty is saved! Then they looked at him. Carlos was difficult to describe without feeling mean, but we're historians, so we'll just use the contemporary descriptions. He was known as El Hechizado, the bewitched. People genuinely thought sorcery was involved because they didn't understand genetics yet. They looked at this poor kid and thought, clearly a witch did this. No, guys, your family tree is a circle. That's what did this. His jaw, the famous Habsburg jaw, was so pronounced that he couldn't chew. His bottom teeth sat way in front of his top teeth. He couldn't close his mouth properly, so he drooled constantly. His tongue was too big for his mouth, so he could barely speak. He didn't learn to talk until he was 4 and didn't walk until he was 8. The ambassadors from other countries would write home about him. They tried to be polite, but it was hard. One French diplomat wrote, "The king is rather short, and his ankles are so weak."
Ancient vapors and the transparent emperor. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little hazy. I want you to go ahead and get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights a bit, or just close your eyes entirely. There's no test at the end of this. We're just going to float through a very long, very detailed history of humanity's obsession with a specific leafy green plant. We are talking, of course, about cannabis, or marijuana, or hemp, or whatever the local villagers were calling it 3,000 years ago, when they realized that burning this particular weed made the long, cold nights on the Central Asian steppe feel just a little bit shorter. It's a story that involves a lot of confused emperors, some very relaxed nomads, and a surprising amount of rope. Before people were using it to expand their minds, they were mostly using it to tie things together, which is practical, I suppose, but significantly less interesting. So let's drift back, way back. We're talking about the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago. The glaciers are receding. Humans are starting to figure out that maybe chasing mammoths is harder than just planting seeds. And somewhere in the vicinity of modern-day Mongolia or southern Siberia, someone stumbles across a plant. Now, botany isn't usually a thrilling subject, which is perfect for us right now. The cannabis plant is essentially a weed. It's robust, it grows like crazy in trash heaps, and it has these fibrous stalks. For thousands of years, that was the main attraction. If you were a Neolithic human, you didn't care about psychoactive properties. You cared that your pants didn't fall apart in the rain. So for millennia, this plant was just the industrial workhorse of the ancient world. It was the beige Camry of agriculture, reliable,
boring, everywhere. But eventually, someone, somewhere, decided to set it on fire. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe they were burning a pile of waste stocks to clear a field, or maybe they were just bored. History rarely records the exact moment of these oops discoveries, but we can assume that whoever was standing downwind of that bonfire suddenly felt much less concerned about the upcoming harvest or the looming threat of tribal warfare, and much more interested in staring at the clouds for 3 hours. Let's float over to the Scythians. If you don't know the Scythians, imagine a group of people who loved horses, gold, and facial hair in equal measure. They were nomads who dominated the Eurasian steppes around the 7th century BC, and we know about their habits thanks to Herodotus. Now, Herodotus is often called the father of history, but he was also the father of exaggerated gossip. He liked a good story, and he wrote about the Scythians with a mix of horror and fascination. According to him, the Scythians had a very specific funeral ritual. Funerals are sad, naturally, so the Scythians apparently decided they needed a way to lighten the mood. After burying a chieftain, they would set up a small tent structure, basically a prehistoric hotbox. They would take red-hot stones, drag them inside the tent, and then throw hemp seeds onto the stones. Herodotus writes, somewhat dramatically, that the Scythians would howl with pleasure as the vapor rose up. Now, howling with pleasure seems a bit intense. It's more likely they were coughing their lungs out and giggling uncontrollably, while Herodotus stood outside with his notepad, judging them. He made a point to say that this vapor bath was better than any Greek steam bath, which is high praise considering how much the Greeks loved their hygiene rituals. But it's a funny image, isn't it? These terrifying warriors, men who were buried with weapons and horses, sitting in a tiny tent, squinting through the smoke, completely toasted. It wasn't just about recreation for them, though. It never really is in the ancient world. It's always religious or medicinal. That's the classic excuse. I'm not intoxicated. I'm communing with the ancestors. Sure you are. But the archaeological evidence backs them up, at least a little bit. We've found braziers, basically ancient incense burners, in tombs in the Pamir Mountains dating back 2,500 years, and sure enough, the residue inside tested positive for high levels of THC. So they were definitely cultivating the plant for its potency. They weren't just burning industrial hemp and hoping for a placebo effect. They knew exactly which plants made the funeral vapor better. Let's drift eastward now, away from the smoky tents of the Scythians, and settle down in ancient China. The relationship with the plant here is a bit more bureaucratic, because of course it is. The Chinese kept records of everything. If you dropped a spoon in the imperial court in 2000 BC, someone probably wrote it down on a bamboo strip. In China, the plant was called ma, just ma. It sounds like someone trailing off in the middle of a sentence, which fits. And for the longest time, ma was mostly about food and fiber. They ate the seeds, they made clothes from the stalks. It was very utilitarian. But then we have the legend of Shen Nong. Shen Nong is a cultural hero, a mythical emperor often called the divine farmer. Legend says he ruled around 2800 BC, though dates that far back are basically just suggestions. Shen Nong was an interesting guy. He was credited with inventing agriculture, the hoe, and the plow, but his real hobby was eating things to see if they would kill him. He supposedly tasted hundreds of herbs to test their medical properties. The most disturbing part of the Shen Nong legend, and this is where things get a little weird, is that he supposedly had a transparent stomach. Yes, transparent, like a glass window. The idea was that he could eat a plant and then look down at his own belly to see how his insides reacted. Oh, that one turned my stomach green. Probably shouldn't eat that again. It's a very convenient medical condition for a toxicologist, though presumably makes dinner parties awkward. Anyway, in the Shen Nong Ben Sao Jing, the great herbal classic attributed to him, cannabis is listed as a supreme elixir, but the description is delightfully vague. It says that if you take it over a long period, it makes you communicate with spirits and lighten one's body. Lighten one's body is a very polite way of saying you will feel like you are floating. But the Chinese were also pragmatic. They noted that if you took too much, you would see devils. So the prescription was essentially take a little to talk to the nice spirits, take a lot to see the demons. It's a delicate balance. By the 2nd century AD, a doctor named Hua Tu, who was very real and unfortunately did not have a transparent stomach, developed an anesthetic called ma fei san. It was a mixture of cannabis powder and wine. He would give this to patients before performing surgery. Imagine that for a moment. You're in Han Dynasty China. You have appendectomy. The doctor walks in, hands you a bowl of weed-infused wine, waits for you to pass out, and then starts cutting. It's terrifying, but arguably better than the alternative, which was biting on a stick. Hua Tu was eventually executed by a warlord who thought the doctor was trying to assassinate him, which is a common hazard for doctors in history. I'm trying to cure your headache. No, you're trying to kill me with your magic wine, and chop. But let's leave the surgeons and the transparent emperors and float down to the Indian subcontinent, because if the Scythians were hotboxing tents and the Chinese were making surgical wine, the ancient Indians were turning the consumption of cannabis into a lifestyle. Here, the plant is entangled with the gods themselves, specifically Shiva. Shiva is one of the principal deities of Hinduism, the destroyer and the transformer. He's a very intense figure. But in the mythology, he's also the lord of bhang. The story goes, and there are many versions because mythology is never consistent, that Shiva had an argument with his family. We've all been there. He stormed off into the fields to cool down. Exhausted and frustrated by domestic drama, he fell asleep under a leafy plant. When he woke, he was naturally hungry. He sampled the leaves of the plant he was sleeping under, and suddenly the family argument didn't seem like such a big deal anymore. He felt great. He declared the plant his favorite food, and thus cannabis became sacred to Shiva. It's a very relatable divine origin story. A god gets stressed, eats a leaf, and decides to chill out for eternity. In the Atharva Veda, which is a collection of texts from around 1500 BC to 1000 BC, cannabis is listed as one of the 5 sacred plants. It was used to relieve anxiety. They called it a source of happiness and a liberator. It's hard to argue with that branding. The liberator sounds like a superhero or a very expensive mattress. Unlike in the West, where the use of such things was often stigmatized or pushed to the fringes, in India it was just part of the culture. Holy men, the sadhus, would use it to aid in meditation. You can still see them today, covered in ash, sitting by the Ganges, smoking from a chillum. The logic is that the plant helps you detach from the material world, and if you've ever seen a
Charles VI came to believe that he was made of glass. Not metaphorically. He believed his buttocks and legs were literally fragile glass. He was terrified that if he sat down too hard, he would shatter. He had special clothes made. His tailors sewed iron rods into his pants and doublets to reinforce him. He refused to let people touch him. If you bumped into him in the hallway, he would scream in terror, checking his ribs to see if they had cracked. He stopped washing because he thought water would weaken his structural integrity. He would run through the palace corridors howling like a wolf. He forgot his name. He forgot he was king. He forgot his wife. When his wife, Queen Isabeau, came to visit, he would shout, "Who is this woman obstructing my view? Get her out!" To cheer him up, the court organized parties. And this leads to one of the most disastrous parties in history, the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. It was 1393. The queen organized a masquerade. The king and 5 of his friends dressed up as wild men. They covered themselves in pitch, tar, and stuck flax and hemp all over their bodies to look like hairy beasts. They were chained together. They danced into the hall, howling and making animal noises. The court loved it. Look at the savages, how entertaining. But the king's brother, the Duke of Orleans, arrived late. He was drunk. He wanted to see who was under the masks. He grabbed a torch and held it too close. Pitch and flax are highly flammable. Whoosh! The dancers went up in flames instantly. Because they were chained together, they couldn't escape. It was a fireball of screaming aristocrats. The king was saved by his young aunt, the Duchess of Berry. She recognized him, grabbed him, and threw her massive velvet skirt over him to smother the flames. She saved his life. 4 of the other dancers died in agony. The king, already fragile, watched his friends burn to death while huddled under a skirt. It did not help his mental state. He spent the rest of his life oscillating between sanity and thinking he was a glass vase. It's a fragile existence, royalty. You're either made of glass, or you're watching your friends catch fire, or you're holding a shirt for a man with a bandage on his bottom. Let's take a break from the humans. They are too stressful. Let's look at the animals again. But not pets this time. We're going to look at animals who were put on trial, legally, in a court of law. This is no joke. In medieval Europe, if a pig committed a crime, the pig got a lawyer. Let's float to a courtroom in France in 1386. The defendant stands in the dock. He, or rather she, is a sow, a pig. She is accused of attacking a child. The judge is serious. The prosecutor reads the charges. The pig has a defense attorney appointed by the state. The lawyer argues, "My client was hungry. She is a simple beast. She did not have mens rea, the guilty mind." The prosecutor argues, "She has tasted blood. She is a danger to society." The judge nods. He consults the law books. He sentences the pig to death. But not just any death. The pig is dressed in human clothes, a vest coat and breeches, and is publicly hanged in the town square. This happened all the time. There are records of trials for pigs, cows, horses, and even swarms of insects. In 1545, the winemakers of St. Julian complained about a plague of weevils eating their grapes. They sued the weevils. The weevils, naturally, did not show up to court. The lawyer for the weevils gave a brilliant speech. He argued that weevils are God's creatures. They have a right to eat. God created the grapes for everyone, not just for the winemakers. Who are we to deny these tiny creatures their sustenance? The case dragged on for months. Finally, the town proposed a compromise. They offered the weevils a designated plot of land outside the vineyard. "If you move to this field, you can eat all the plants you want, and we will leave you alone." The lawyer for the weevils inspected the land. He rejected the offer. He argued that the land was sterile and lacked sufficient foliage. The trial continued. We actually don't know the final verdict because the last page of the court record was eaten by rats, or maybe by weevils, which feels like the weevils won in the end. There is something delightful about a society that takes the rule of law so seriously that they feel the need to legally negotiate with bugs. It's absurd, but it's also weirdly respectful. We can't just kill them, we have to sue them first. Let's leave the courtroom of the bugs. The sun is setting, the air is cooling. We're going to drift to the 18th century, to the foggy streets of London. We're going to talk about a craze, a mania. Not for tulips, not for stocks, for pineapples. The pineapple was the ultimate status symbol of the 1700s. It was exotic. It came from the tropics. It was incredibly hard to grow in cold, rainy England. You needed a pinery, a special heated greenhouse. It cost a fortune in coal and labor. A single pineapple could cost the equivalent of $8,000 today. You didn't eat a pineapple. That would be like eating a Ferrari. You'd display it. If you had a dinner party, the pineapple was the centerpiece. It sat there, glorious and spiky, telling everyone, "I am rich." But what if you were middle class? What if you wanted to look rich but couldn't afford the fruit? You rented one. There were pineapple rental shops. You could rent a pineapple for the night.
You'd carry it down the street, maybe under your arm, looking casual. "Oh, this? Just my pineapple. Taking it for a walk." You'd put it on your table for the party. Guests would admire it. "A lovely specimen, Lord Timothy." "Yes, quite." Then, the next morning, you'd return it. The only rule was, do not cut it. If you rented a scratched or bruised pineapple, you got a discount. It was the scratch and dent aisle of fruit. People carried pineapples in their portraits. King Charles II posed with a pineapple. It was the iPhone of the era. If you didn't have one, you were nobody.
The courtier would immediately regret speaking. "No, Your Majesty, it's fine. It's gone." "Nonsense," Peter would say, reaching for his pliers. "Open wide." He would pull the tooth. Sometimes he pulled the wrong tooth. Sometimes he pulled a healthy tooth just for practice. He kept the teeth. He had a sack full of them. You can still see them today in the Kunstkamera Museum in St. Petersburg. A bag of old yellow teeth pulled from the mouths of terrifyingly polite Russian nobles who were too afraid to say no to the emperor. Peter also had a fascination with curiosities similar to the Western courts. He collected people. He had a giant regiment of tall soldiers, and he had a fondness for dwarfs, often holding elaborate mock weddings for them, where the entire court had to dress up in ridiculous costumes. But his most chaotic invention was the all-joking, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters. This was a club, Peter found it. It was a parody of the church hierarchy. Peter appointed a prince-pope to lead it. The goal of the club was simple: drink until you fall down. They had meetings that lasted for days. If you tried to leave, guards would stop you. If you tried to not drink, Peter would be offended. And you do not want to offend a 6'8" man holding dental pliers. They had a chalice called the Great Eagle. It was a massive cup that held something like 1.5 liters of vodka or wine. If you arrived late to the party, your penalty was to drink the Great Eagle in one go. Many foreign ambassadors wrote home about the terror of being invited to Peter's parties. "I am afraid I will die," one wrote. "The Tsar insists we drink brandy out of a scoop." It wasn't a party, it was a hostage situation with alcohol. Let's leave the vodka-soaked halls of St. Petersburg and drift over to Scandinavia. Let's talk about a king who didn't die from drink, but from dinner. King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden. Adolf Fredrik ruled in the mid-18th century. He was a mild-mannered man. He liked making snuff boxes at his lathe. He was a bit of a pushover politically, but he is remembered for one thing: his death. It was Shrove Tuesday, 1771, a day for feasting before Lent. Adolf Fredrik sat down for a meal. Now, get ready for this menu. He started with lobster, then caviar, then kippers, smoked herring, then sauerkraut, then boiled meat, and he washed it all down with champagne. That alone is a heavy meal. That's a lot of salt and cabbage. But the king wasn't done. He had a sweet tooth. Specifically, he loved semlas. A semla is a traditional Swedish bun. It's a wheat bun filled with almond paste and cream. Back then, it was often served in a bowl of hot milk. It's rich, heavy, and delicious. Adolf Fredrik ate one, then another, then another. According to the records, he ate 14 servings of semla. 14! After the meal, he reportedly said, "I don't feel entirely well," which is the understatement of the century. He suffered from severe indigesting, cramps, and likely a stroke caused by the sheer strain on his system. He died later that night. Count Axel von Fersen, a name you might know if you're into Marie Antoinette history, wrote in his diary, "His Majesty's life was ended by a meal of sauerkraut and buns." He is known to Swedish schoolchildren as the king who ate himself to death. It's a tragic way to go, but at least he died doing what he loved, eating pastries. It seems royal stomachs were often their downfall. Let's float back to England for a moment, to Henry I. Henry I was the son of William the Conqueror.
He was a serious guy. He ruled for a long time. But in 1135, he was in Normandy. He went hunting. He was feeling good. He decided he wanted to eat lampreys. If you don't know what a lamprey is, imagine an eel from a nightmare. It's a jawless fish with a round sucker mouth filled with rows of sharp teeth. It latches onto other fish and sucks their blood. It is an aquatic vampire. For some reason, medieval royalty considered this a delicacy. They loved lamprey pie. Henry's doctors had told him, "Your Majesty, you are getting old. Your digestion is not what it used to be. Avoid the lampreys. They are too rich for you." Henry, being a king, said, "I do what I want." He ate a surfeit of lampreys. That's the phrase history uses. A surfeit. Too many. Predictably, he got sick. A sudden fever, the chronicle says. He died a few days later. The irony is that lampreys are actually quite gross to prepare. You have to hang them up and bleed them, then cook them in their own blood with wine and spices to mask the muddy taste. It's a lot of effort for a fish that looks like a vacuum cleaner hose. But status is status. If the king eats the nightmare eel, everyone eats the nightmare eel. Let's pivot from stomachs to noses. We're going to talk about Tycho Brahe. Tycho was a Danish astronomer in the late 1500s. He was brilliant. Before telescopes were really a thing, he mapped the stars with incredible accuracy just by looking at them and using giant protractors. But the first thing you would notice about Tycho was his face. When he was a student at the University of Rostock, he got into an argument with a fellow student named Manderup, Parsberg. They were arguing about who was the better mathematician. It was a nerd fight. But in the 16th century, nerd fights ended with swords. They challenged each other to a duel in the dark. Tycho lost. Specifically, he lost the bridge of his nose. Manderup sliced it right off. So for the rest of his life, Tycho Brahe wore a prosthetic nose. It was attached with glue or paste. For everyday wear, he had a nose made of copper or brass, but for special occasions, he allegedly had a nose made of gold and silver. Imagine talking to him. You're trying to discuss the orbit of Mars, but you can't stop staring at the shiny metal chunk in the middle of his face. Is that polished brass, Tycho? Yes, I buffed it this morning. Tycho was incredibly wealthy. The king of Denmark gave him an entire island called Hen. He built a castle there called Uranborg. It was a research center/party mansion. He had running water, an alchemy lab, and a printing press. He also had a pet moose, or an elk, depending on the translation. This moose was a local celebrity. It would trot alongside Tycho's carriage like a dog. But the moose had a tragic end. Tycho lent the moose to a nobleman friend for a party in a nearby town. The nobleman thought it would be funny to give the moose beer. The moose liked the beer. It drank a lot of it. The drunk moose then decided to explore the castle. It tried to climb the stairs. A drunk moose and a spiral staircase are a bad combination. The moose fell down the stairs, broke its leg, and had to be put down. Tycho was heartbroken. He wrote a very sad letter about it. "My moose is dead." It sounds like a line from a surrealist play.
Because of course it was. Let's take a breath. That was a lot of royal misfortune. From the inbred chins of Spain to the severed necks of England, it's exhausting just thinking about the maintenance these people require. Let's float away from the palaces for a bit. Let's go somewhere quieter. A library. A very old, very dusty library. We're going to talk about books, but not just any books. We're going to talk about the books bound in human skin. Yes, that's a real thing. It's called anthropodermic bibliopegy. It sounds like a spell from Harry Potter, but it's actually just a fancy term for we ran out of leather, so we used Dave. We'll get into the texture of that history right after this transition. The leather that wasn't, and the man who stuffed himself. So we are in the library. It's quiet. It smells of old paper and dust. You pull a book off the shelf.
It's a copy of De Humani Corporis Fabrica by Andreas Vesalius, a seminal work on human anatomy. You admire the binding. It's smooth, slightly pebbled, maybe a pale beige. It feels organic. And then you open the front cover and read a handwritten note from the binder. This book is bound in the skin of the author's patient who died of the very fever described in Chapter 4. Welcome to the world of anthropodermic bibliopegy. It is a polysyllabic way of saying that for a few centuries, doctors and bibliophiles had zero chill when it came to their binding materials. It wasn't done out of malice, usually. It wasn't like a horror movie where a villain is making a suit. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it was often done as a strange form of memorial or respect, or just cold clinical curiosity. Doctors, in particular, were the main culprits. A doctor would perform an autopsy, see a particularly interesting piece of skin, and think, you know what? This would look great on my copy of Gray's Anatomy. There's a famous example at the Boston Athenaeum. It's a memoir of a highwayman named James Allen. James was a career criminal, a robber. On his deathbed, he asked that a copy of his confession be bound in his own skin and given to the man he tried to rob. It's the ultimate "my bad" gift. Sorry I tried to mug you. Here is my life story wrapped in my own epidermis. The man he robbed actually kept it, which says a lot about him, too. But the most famous, or infamous case, involves William Burke. You might know the name, Burke and Hare, the Resurrection Men. Let's drift over to Edinburgh, Scotland in the 1920s. It's a dark, foggy, cobblestoned place. The medical schools are booming. Edinburgh is the center of anatomical study in the world. Everyone wants to be a doctor. And to be a doctor, you need to dissect bodies. The problem was supply and demand. The law said you could only dissect executed criminals, but the crime rate wasn't high enough to keep up with the number of medical students. There were too many students and not enough murderers being hanged, a classic economic bottleneck. Enter the Resurrection Men. These were entrepreneurs who would sneak into graveyards at night, dig up the freshly buried, and sell them to the doctors. It was a lucrative gig. Doctors didn't ask questions. They just paid by the inch. Fresh corpse? Excellent. Put it on the table. Here's 5 guineas. Burke and Hare, however, were lazy. Digging is hard work. The dirt is heavy, it's cold, you might get caught. They realized there was a vertically integrated solution. Just make the bodies yourself. They started suffocating people. They ran a boarding house, which was convenient. If a lodger looked a bit sickly or didn't have any family, Burke and Hare would get them drunk, and then, well, they called it burking. One person sits on the chest, the other holds the nose and mouth. No marks, no blood, perfect for dissection. They sold 16 bodies to Dr. Robert Knox, a very famous anatomist, who conveniently ignored the fact that the bodies were incredibly fresh and never seemed to have been buried. Knox was the kind of guy who prioritized science over minor ethical details like, where did this warm body come from? Eventually, they got caught. Hare turned King's evidence and testified against Burke to save his own neck. Burke was hanged. And here is where the irony gets delicious. Burke's body was given to the medical school to be dissected. The man who provided bodies for dissection became the body for dissection. It's the circle of life in the grossest way possible. But it didn't stop there. The surgeon, Alexander Monroe, dipped his quill pen into Burke's blood and wrote, "This is written with the blood of William Burke, who was hanged in Edinburgh." Then, because why not, they took some of his skin and made a pocketbook out of it, a small wallet. It's still in the Surgeons' Hall Museum in Edinburgh. You can go see it. It looks like a cheap leather wallet you'd buy at a gas station, except it used to be a serial killer. Speaking of people who ended up as museum exhibits, let's float down to London to visit Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was a philosopher, the father of utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. He was a very eccentric man. He had a cat named the Reverend Sir John Langbourne. He gave his walking stick a name, Dapple, and he was obsessed with the idea that burying bodies was a waste. He thought, why should I rot in the ground when I can continue to be useful? So in his will, he requested that his body be dissected for science, utilitarian to the end. Then his skeleton be reconstructed, padded out with hay, dressed in his own clothes, and placed in a glass box. He called it his auto-icon. And they did it. If you go to University College London, UCL, today, you can walk down a hallway and there he is, Jeremy Bentham, sitting in a wooden cabinet, wearing his 18th century coat and breeches, holding his favorite walking stick. He looks like a waxwork, but the skeleton underneath is real. The head, however, that was a problem. The mummification process for the head went wrong. It ended up looking like a terrifying, leathery prune. It was so hideous they couldn't put it on the body, so they made a wax head for the display. But for years, the real, dried-out head sat on the floor of the cabinet between his feet, just sitting there, staring at his own shoes. Generations of students at UCL found this hilarious. The head was stolen multiple times. In 1975, students kidnapped the head and demanded a ransom of £100 to be donated to a charity. The university paid it. On another occasion, the head was found in a luggage locker at a train station in Scotland. Eventually, the university realized that maybe keeping a mummified philosopher's head on the floor was a liability, so they locked it away in a safe, but the body is still there. Legend has it that Bentham is recorded as present but not voting at council meetings. That's probably a myth, but I choose to believe it. It fits the vibe. A man who refused to leave the meeting just because he died 200 years ago. Let's drift away from the academics and the murderers and look at how regular people dealt with death in the 19th century. Because if you think binding books in skin is weird, wait till you hear about the family photo albums. The Victorians were obsessed with death. Queen Victoria mourned her husband Albert for 40 years wearing black every single day until she died. She set the trend. Mourning became a fashion statement. There were strict rules. You had to wear non-reflective black fabric, crepe, for a year. Then you could move to half mourning, which allowed grays and purples. If you wore a bright yellow hat 2 months after your husband died, you were basically canceled. But the weirdest trend was memento mori photography, post-mortem photography. Photography was new and expensive. Most people couldn't afford a portrait while they were alive, but when a family member died, especially a child, the family would scrape together the money for one single photo, a final memory. So the photographer would come to the house, they would dress the body in their Sunday best, they would pose them. Sometimes they would prop them up on a stand. Sometimes they would paint eyes onto the closed eyelids of the photo to make them look awake.
Duke, you own vast estates. You command armies. And the highlight of your career is holding a linen shirt while a sleepy man in a wig puts his arms through the sleeves. If the king glanced at you, you were made. If he ignored you, you were ruined. I saw the king today. Did he see you? No, he was looking at his socks. Oh, terrible luck, Pierre. But the most intimate and therefore the most coveted position was the groom of the stool. In England, this was a formal title, Groom of the King's Close Stool. The close stool was a portable toilet, a velvet-covered box with a hole in it and a pot underneath. The groom's job was to assist, to provide water, towels, and a helping hand. It sounds humiliating to us, but in the 17th century, this was the ultimate power move. Why? Because the king is vulnerable when he's on the toilet. He's bored. He's a captive audience. If you're the guy handing him the paper, you're the guy who can whisper, "By the way, Your Majesty, my cousin needs a promotion." The groom of the stool knew the king's health better than the doctors. He was the keeper of the royal secrets, quite literally. And speaking of royal health, we have to talk about the year of the fistula. In 1686, Louis XIV developed a pain in a very sensitive area. It was an anal fistula, a painful abscess. The court panicked. The Sun King could not sit down. He couldn't ride a horse. He was grumpy. And when the Sun King is grumpy, France is miserable. The doctors tried everything. Poultices, enemas, holy water, nothing worked. Enter Charles Francois Felix, the royal surgeon. He looked at the problem and said, "I can cut it out, but I've never done this operation before." Now, you don't practice on the King of France. If you slip, you get executed. So Felix needed practice subjects. He went to the hospitals and prisons of Paris. He gathered about 75 men who had similar conditions, and he operated on them. Most of them didn't make it, but Felix learned. He developed a special curved scalpel, which he named the Royal Probe. After months of practice, he told the king he was ready. The operation took place on November 18, 1686. It was done without anesthesia, because anesthesia hadn't been invented yet. The king lay on his stomach. The minister of war held his hand. Felix cut. The king didn't scream. He reportedly said, "Is it done, gentlemen? Finish, and do not treat me like a king. Treat me as if I were a peasant." Which is a very brave thing to say when someone is taking a knife to your backside. The surgery was a success. The king healed. Felix was given a massive fortune and a title. But here is the best part. The court of Versailles was so obsessed with imitating the king that the fistula became fashionable. Courtiers who didn't have a fistula started padding their breeches with bandages to look like they had just had surgery. They walked with a limp. They bragged about their pain. "Oh, my bottom is killing me today." Lucky you, I wish I had a royal abscess. It was the peak of sycophancy, bandaging your healthy rear end to show solidarity with the king's medical drama. There is also a persistent legend, though musicologists debate it, that the anthem God Save the King was originally written to celebrate Louis's recovery from this surgery. The nuns of Saint-Cyr supposedly wrote a song called Grand Dieu sauve le roi, Great God Save the King, to thank God for the successful operation on the royal bottom. It was later translated and adopted by the British. Whether it's true or not, it's a funny thought that the British national anthem might be a celebration of a French proctological success. Let's leave the bandages of Versailles and drift south across the Pyrenees to Spain. We're going back to the Habsburgs, but before the worst of the chins set in. We're going to talk about a woman whose love was so intense it was terrifying. Juana of Castile, or as history remembers her, Juana la Loca, Juana the Mad. Juana was the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, the Christopher Columbus sponsors. She was married off to Philip the Handsome. Philip was the Duke of Burgundy. He was a Habsburg, and he was, by all accounts, very good-looking. He was also a terrible husband. He was vain, unfaithful, and ambitious. But Juana was obsessed with him. It was a passionate, volatile marriage. When he cheated, she attacked his mistresses with scissors. She screamed, she cried. The court thought she was unstable. But the real madness began when Philip died suddenly in 1606. He was 28. He drank some cold water after playing a ball game and dropped dead. Or he was poisoned. It's always 50-50. Juana was pregnant at the time. She was devastated. She refused to leave his body. And I mean, she really refused. She wouldn't let them bury him. She insisted on traveling with the coffin. For months, she led a funeral procession across Spain at night by torchlight. She said the daylight was too happy for a widow. So picture this, a queen, heavily pregnant, dressed in black rags, walking behind a hearse through the Spanish countryside at 3 a.m. Every now and then, she would order the procession to stop. She would have the coffin opened so she could kiss Philip's feet. The body was decomposing. It had been embalmed, but not well. It didn't look like Philip the Handsome anymore. It looked like Philip the Gray and leathery. But Juana didn't care. She was terrified that another woman would try to steal him, even though he was dead. She wouldn't let any women near the corpse. Nuns were forbidden from approaching the coffin. "Get back! He's mine!"
Eventually, her father, Ferdinand, intervened. He had her declared insane and locked her up in a castle at Tordesillas. She spent the rest of her life, nearly 50 years, locked in a room. She slept on the floor, she refused to wash, she would stare out the window waiting for Philip to come back. Was she actually mad, or was she just a grieving woman surrounded by men who wanted her crown? Probably a bit of both. But the image of her wandering the dark roads of Castile with her dead husband is one of the most gothic, haunting visuals in history. From a queen who wouldn't let go to a king who was afraid he would break. Let's float back to France, a century before Louis XIV. King Charles VI, the beloved and then the mad. King Charles VI started out great, young, handsome, popular. Then in 1392, he was riding through a forest on a hot August day. A leopard dressed in rags jumped out from behind a tree and grabbed his horse's bridle. "Ride no further, noble king! Turn back! You are betrayed!" The guards chased the man away, but Charles was shaken. He rode on in silence. The heat was oppressive. Suddenly, a page dropped a lance. The metal clattered loudly on a helmet. Charles snapped. He drew his sword and attacked his own men. He killed 4 knights before they could wrestle him to the ground. He was screaming about traitors. He fell into a coma. When he woke up, he was different. This was the beginning of his glass delusion.
That he could not be endured within the distance of 20 paces. When he ate, his body would get hot, and a visible vapor would rise off him like steam from a compost heap. He eventually joined the French Revolutionary Army, but military rations, which were meager at best, were not enough for him. He would do chores for other soldiers in exchange for their scraps. He would scavenge in the gutters. The military doctors were fascinated. They brought him to the hospital to run tests. They gave him a live cat. He ate it. They gave him snakes. He ate them. One general had a bright idea. Wait, he thought, if he can swallow anything, maybe he can be a spy. The plan was simple. They wrote a secret message on a piece of paper, put it inside a small wooden box, and had Tarrare swallow the box. The idea was that he would cross enemy lines, pass the box, you know how, and deliver the message. It was a terrible plan. Tarrare was captured almost immediately because he didn't speak German and looked like a starving, sweating madman. The Prussians caught him, waited for nature to take its course, found the box, read the message, which turned out to just be a test message asking if he arrived safely, and then beat him up and sent him back. Tarrare returned to the hospital, desperate for a cure. He begged the doctors to make him stop eating. They tried everything: tobacco pills, wine vinegar, soft-boiled eggs. Nothing worked. He was caught drinking the blood from patients undergoing bloodletting. He was caught in a morgue, doing things we won't describe in detail. Eventually, a toddler went missing from the hospital. The staff looked at Tarrare. Tarrare looked at the staff. They chased him out. He died a few years later of tuberculosis. When they performed the autopsy, they found his stomach was enormous, filling almost his entire abdominal cavity. His liver was huge. His body was essentially just one giant digestive tract designed to consume the world. It's a sad story, really. A man cursed with a hunger that could never be satisfied. He wasn't a monster. He was just an endless, tragic void. From a man who put things into his body that didn't belong there, to a woman who claimed things came out of her body that definitely didn't belong there. Let's float over to Godalming, England. The year is 1726. Mary Toft was a peasant woman. One day she went into labor, but she didn't give birth to a baby. She gave birth to animal parts, specifically rabbits. She claimed that she had been startled by a rabbit in a field while pregnant, and it had influenced her unborn child. This was based on an old medical theory called maternal impression, the idea that what a pregnant woman sees can change the baby. So the local doctor, John Howard, comes over. He delivers a rabbit leg, then a cat's liver, then another rabbit leg. He is baffled.
He writes to the experts in London, "Guys, you have to see this." The king's own surgeon, Nathaniel St. Andre, comes down. He watches Mary go into labor. He delivers half a rabbit. He is convinced. He writes a pamphlet called A Short Narrative of an Extraordinary Delivery of Rabbits. The news goes viral. The King of England, George I, is interested. The Prince of Wales is interested. Mary Toft becomes a celebrity. She is moved to a nice bathhouse in London so the top doctors can study her. People stopped eating rabbit stew. The market for rabbit meat crashed because nobody wanted to eat something that might have come out of a woman from Surrey. But then the skepticism started. A famous physician named Sir Richard Madingham showed up. He was smarter than the others. He noticed that the rabbits Mary was birthing were processed. One of them had dung inside it, containing corn, hay, and straw. Now, unless Mary Toft had a tiny farm inside her uterus, there was no way a prenatal rabbit could have eaten hay. Manningham threatened to perform surgery on Mary to see exactly how this works. Mary, realizing they were about to cut her open, confessed. She had been manually inserting the rabbit parts. I will leave the mechanics of that to your imagination, but suffice it to say, it was uncomfortable and required a lot of commitment to the bit. She was arrested for being a vile cheat and impostor. The medical community was humiliated. Saint Andre, the king's surgeon, was ruined. He had published a book saying it was real, and now he looked like the biggest idiot in Europe. The satirist William Hogarth drew cartoons mocking them. Mary Toft was imprisoned for a few months, then released. She went back to Godalming and died in obscurity. But for one brief, furry moment, she held the attention of the entire scientific world. Why did she do it? Money? Fame? Or just the desire to see if she could? Sometimes history doesn't have a deep reason. Sometimes people just want to trick a doctor with a bunny. Let's leave the rabbits and the hunger. Let's go to America, to a man who was the Forrest Gump of the 18th century. A man so lucky and so stupid that he became a millionaire by accident. Timothy Dexter. Lord Timothy Dexter, as he called himself. Dexter lived in Newburyport, Massachusetts in the late 1700s. He was a leather dresser by trade. He had little education and no business sense, but he had money, he married a wealthy widow, and he wanted to be accepted by the high society elites. The elites hated him. They thought he was an annoying, illiterate pest, so they decided to ruin him. They gave him terrible investment advice. They told him, jokingly, you know what would make a lot of money? Sending warming pans to the West Indies. Now, a warming pan is a metal pan on a stick that you fill with hot coals and put under your bed sheets to warm them in a freezing New England winter. Sending them to the Caribbean, a tropical paradise, was a joke. It was like selling ice to Eskimos. Dexter didn't get the joke. He bought 42,000 warming pans and chartered a ship. When the ship arrived in the West Indies, the captain couldn't sell them as bed warmers, obviously, but the local molasses industry looked at them and said, hey, these are perfect ladles for skimming molasses vats. They bought every single one. Dexter made a fortune. The elites were furious. They tried again. Okay, Timothy, they said, send coal to Newcastle. Carrying coals to Newcastle is an idiom. Newcastle is a coal mining city. It's the one place on earth that doesn't need coal. Dexter didn't know the idiom. He shipped boatloads of American coal to Newcastle. When his ships arrived, there was a miners' strike in Newcastle. The city was desperate for coal. Dexter sold his shipment at a massive premium. He made another fortune. He bought up stray cats because someone told him it was a good idea. He shipped them to the Caribbean. It turned out there was a rat infestation in the warehouses there. The cats were sold for top dollar. He could not lose.
He built a mansion. He lined the front yard with 40 wooden statues of famous men, George Washington, Napoleon, and himself. The inscription on his statue read, "I is the first in the East, the first in the West, and the greatest philosopher in the Western world." He faked his own death to see who would cry. 3,000 people showed up to the wake. His wife, however, didn't cry enough for his liking, so he revealed he was alive and then caned her for not being sad enough. He wrote a book, A Pickle for the Knowing Ones. It was a rambling, incoherent mess of terrible spelling and random thoughts. It had no punctuation, none, just pages of text without a single period or comma. When people complained that it was hard to read, he released a second edition. At the very end of the book, he added a page full of periods, commas, and question marks. He wrote a note saying, essentially, "Here is the punctuation. Pepper and salt it as you please." Timothy Dexter died rich, famous, and completely misunderstood. He's the patron saint of failing upwards, a reminder that sometimes you don't need to be smart. You just need to buy the warming pans. Let's drift away from the lucky fool. Let's go to the Victorian era again, to a quiet parsonage in Yorkshire. We are going to visit the Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne. They wrote Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, dark, brooding masterpieces of English literature. But their personal lives were just as strange as their books. They lived in the middle of nowhere, next to a graveyard. Their father was a parson who ate his meals alone in his room because he had sensitive digestion. He also had a habit of firing his pistol out the window every morning to discharge it. Imagine waking up every day to the sound of your dad shooting a gun at the garden shed. The sisters were incredibly isolated. To entertain themselves as children, they created imaginary worlds, Gondal and Angria. But these weren't just cute stories, they were obsessed. They wrote tiny books the size of a matchbox, filled with microscopic handwriting, detailing the politics, wars, and romances of their imaginary kingdoms. They kept this up well into adulthood. Emily Bronte, the author of Wuthering Heights, was particularly intense. She was described as a wild thing. She had no friends. She loved the moors. She had a dog named Keeper. Keeper was a massive, fierce mastiff. One day, Keeper went upstairs and slept on the clean white bedspreads, which was forbidden. The servant was too scared to move him. Emily walked in. She didn't shout. She grabbed the giant dog by the scruff of the neck, dragged him downstairs, and punched him in the face with her bare fist. The dog loved her and obeyed her perfectly after that. When Emily was dying of tuberculosis at age 30, she refused to see a doctor. She refused medicine. She tried to go about her daily routine, leaning against the walls for support, gasping for breath. She only agreed to see a doctor at 2 p.m. on the day she died. By then, it was too late. She was as stubborn as the granite on the moors. There is a sadness to the Brontes. All three sisters and their brother Branwell, who was a chaotic alcoholic and opium addict, died young. Their father outlived them all. He sat in that house next to the graveyard, listening to the wind, with no one left to shoot pistols out the window with. Let's leave the windy moors. It's too drafty there. Let's go to a place that is warm. Let's go to bed. But not just any bed. Let's go to the bed of a wealthy 18th century aristocrat who's afraid of the dark. This brings us to the concept of the night light. Before electricity, the night was pitch black and scary, so people got creative. There was something called a rush light. You took a reed from a river, dipped it in animal fat, tallow, and let it dry. It was the poor man's candle. It burned with a weak, sputtering light and smelled like burning bacon fat. If you were rich, you had beeswax candles, but you didn't want to burn a whole candle all night. That's expensive. So they invented the mortar. It was a small cup filled with oil and a floating wick. It gave off just enough light to see if a ghost was in the room, but not enough to keep you awake. But the most interesting sleep invention was the knocker-up. We didn't always have alarm clocks, so during the Industrial Revolution, how did factory workers wake up at 4 a.m.? They hired a human alarm clock. The knocker-up was a person, usually an old man or woman, who walked the streets with a long bamboo pole. They would tap on your bedroom window. Tap, tap, tap. You paid them a few pennies a week.
They wouldn't leave until they saw you move. Some knocker-ups used pea shoots. They would shoot dried peas at your window pane. Imagine being woken up by a gentle hail of legumes. It was a whole profession, but it begs the question, who woke up the knocker-up? There was a rhyme about it. We had a knocker-up, and our knocker-up had a knocker-up, and our knocker-up's knocker-up didn't knock our knocker-up, so our knocker-up didn't knock us up 'cause he's not up. It's a tongue twister of sleep deprivation. Let's think about that silence now. The silence of the streets before the knocker-up arrives. The silence of the library with the skin-bound books. The silence of the ocean where the Vasa sits. You are drifting. The history of the world is just a long list of people trying to figure out how to live. Some ate boxes. Some wore extra shirts. Some sued weevils. They're all gone now. They're all sleeping. And you can sleep too. We have covered emperors, sharks, dwarves, and pies. We have traveled from the steppes of Mongolia to the hills of San Francisco. The timeline is a soft blanket. It wraps around everything. It smooths out the edges. Charles II's chin doesn't hurt anymore. Terrar isn't hungry anymore. The Greenland shark is still swimming, but he's doing it for you. So close your eyes. Let the facts dissolve. Let the dates fade away. There is no test. There is only the drift. Good night, guys.
Eventually, steamships made transport easier, and pineapples became cheap. The status symbol collapsed. Now we put them on pizza and argue about it. But for a brief moment, that spiky fruit was the crown jewel of English society. Let's take a deep breath. Imagine the smell of a fresh pineapple. Sweet, acidic, sharp. Now let's imagine the smell of a very, very old cheese. Because in 1840, Queen Victoria received a wedding gift. It was a wheel of cheddar cheese. But not just any wheel. It weighed 1,000 pounds. It was made from the milk of 750 cows. It was a behemoth. The farmers of Somerset made it. They were very proud. They exhibited it in London before giving it to the Queen. But there was a problem. A cheese that big doesn't age evenly. By the time they got it to the palace, it was ripe. The Queen accepted it politely, but she didn't want to eat it, and she couldn't throw it away because it was a gift from the people. So it sat. It sat in the palace. It started to smell. It started to ooze. Eventually, they tried to give it back to the farmers. The farmers said, "No thanks, no takebacks." It became a national issue. What do we do with the royal cheese? In the end, it just sort of disappeared, likely chopped up and fed to the palace pigs or buried in a quiet corner of the garden. But it's a reminder that not all gifts are good gifts. Sometimes a gift is just a half-ton of rotting dairy. Let's leave the cheese. Let's float away from the smells of the past. We are going to move towards the sea, the open ocean, the sound of waves. We are going to talk about a ship, but not a successful ship. We are going to talk about the Vasa, the pride of the Swedish Navy, the Titanic of the 17th century. It was built to be the most powerful warship in the world. King Gustavus Adolphus ordered it. He wanted more guns. "Add another deck of guns," he said. The shipbuilders were nervous. "Sire, that will make the ship top-heavy. It will be unstable." "Nonsense," said the king. "I want big guns. I want statues. I want gold leaf." So they built it. It was magnificent. It was covered in carved wooden sculptures of Roman emperors and lions. It was painted in bright colors. It was a floating palace. On August 10th, 1628, the Vasa launched. The whole city of Stockholm came out to watch. The ports were opened. The guns fired a salute. The ship sailed about 1,300 meters. A light breeze, a gentle puff of wind, hit the sails. The ship tipped. The lower gun ports were open for the salute. Water rushed in. And just like that, in front of the horrified king and the entire population, the most expensive ship in the world sank like a stone.
It took about 20 minutes. It sat at the bottom of Stockholm Harbor for 331 years. In the 1960s, they raised it. Because the Baltic Sea is so cold and lacks the shipworm that eats wood, the Vasa was perfectly preserved. You can go see it today. It is 98% original wood. It is massive, it is beautiful, and it is a monument to the fact that you should listen to your engineers when they say, "That's too many guns, Your Majesty." The king, of course, blamed everyone else, but we know it was the extra deck. Physics does not care about your crown. Let's stay with the water theme, but let's go deeper, to the creatures of the deep. We've talked about lampreys, but have you heard of the Greenland shark? This is a creature that fits our sleepy vibe perfectly. The Greenland shark moves at a speed of about 0.7 miles per hour. It is the slowest shark in the world. It looks like a gray, lumpy log. It is often blind because of a parasite that eats its eyes. But here is the kicker. It lives for 400 years. There are sharks swimming in the Arctic right now that were born before the United States existed. They were babies when Shakespeare was writing Hamlet. They were teenagers when the Vasa sank. They just swim, slowly, in the dark, doing nothing. Their hearts beat once every 10 seconds. It is the ultimate chill. No stress, no rushing. Just 400 years of slow, blind swimming in icy water. If reincarnation is real, and you've been very, very tired in this life, maybe you come back as a Greenland shark, just drifting. That sounds nice, doesn't it? Just drifting. We have a few more stories to tell. Stories of people who tried to conquer the world, and stories of people who just wanted to be left alone. We'll talk about the man who ate everything, literally everything, including a quarter of a cow. And we'll talk about the woman who gave birth to rabbits, or at least she said she did. But we'll save those strange tales for the next drift. The bottomless pit, the rabbit trap, and the man who sold coal to Newcastle. So, we promised you the man who ate everything, and I mean everything. His name was Tarre. He was born in rural France around 1772, and from the moment he could chew, he was a problem. Tarre had an appetite that defied physics. As a teenager, he could eat a quarter of a cow in a single day and still be hungry. His parents, who were poor farmers, eventually had to kick him out because he was literally eating them out of house and home. "Sorry, son, we love you, but you ate the tractor." So Tarre hit the road. He joined a traveling freak show. His act? The crowd would hand him things, and he would swallow them. Apples, flints, corks, entire baskets of apples. He would swallow live animals, eels, lizards, puppies. He would swallow them whole without chewing. Physically, he was a mess. He had a huge, slack mouth with almost no lips. His teeth were stained, and he smelled. Oh, how he smelled. Doctors recorded that he stank to such a degree
he often falls over. Imagine the scene. The majestic king of Spain, lord of the Americas, trying to walk to the throne and just tipping over like a poorly stacked pile of books. He was treated with a mix of reverence and pity. His mother, Mariana of Austria, who was coincidentally his father's niece, because of course she was terrified he would die at any moment, so she wrapped him in cotton wool, literally and metaphorically. He wasn't allowed to be educated because they thought studying would strain his fragile brain. So you have a king who can't chew, can't walk well, and can't read, running the largest empire on earth. And the court's solution to his health problems? Exorcisms, obviously. When Charles had a seizure or a hallucination, they didn't call a doctor, they called a priest to splash holy water on him. At one point, they forced him to sleep with the mummified remains of saints in his bed. Just picture that. You're already sickly, confused, and drooling, and now you have to share your pillow with the dusty shin bone of St. Francis. It's not conducive to a good night's sleep. But Charles is just the finale. The build-up to him is a long conga line of increasingly prognathous chins. Let's float back to his great-great-grandfather, Charles V. He was the Holy Roman Emperor, a very powerful man. He ruled an empire where the sun never set. But he also had a jaw so big that he had a special exception from the Pope to take communion. Usually you had to close your mouth around the wafer. Charles physically couldn't, so the Pope said, "It's fine, just do your best." Charles V was self-aware at least. He used to joke about it. When he went to Spain for the first time, a bold peasant shouted, "Your Majesty, close your mouth. The flies of this country are very insolent." Charles apparently laughed, or tried to laugh. It was probably more of a wheeze. He was a warrior king, always on horseback, fighting Protestants, fighting the French, fighting the Ottomans, but he was miserable. He had gout, he had asthma, he had indigestion because he couldn't chew his food. He just swallowed chunks of meat whole like a pelican. By the end of his life, he was so tired of being the emperor and having everything hurt that he just quit. He abdicated. He gave Spain to his son and the empire to his brother, and he retired to a monastery to stare at clocks. That's a true story. He filled his room with clocks and tried to make them all chime at the exact same second. He never succeeded. It drove him crazy. It's a perfect metaphor for the Habsburgs, trying to control an intricate system that just refuses to work in harmony. Then there's Philip II, his son, the prudent. A man who sat in a stone room in the Escorial Palace reading paperwork for 14 hours a day. He was the ultimate micromanager. He knew how many candles were being used in a fortress in Peru. He was humorless, pious, and dressed entirely in black. He looked like a depressing ink stain on the colorful map of Europe. Philip married Mary Tudor of England, Bloody Mary. That was a match made in, well, not heaven. Mary adored him. Philip found her repulsive, but married her for duty. He spent as little time in England as possible. When Mary died, he didn't even pretend to be sad. He wrote to his sister, "I felt a reasonable regret for her death." Reasonable regret. That is the most unromantic sentence in history. I am reasonably bummed out. Philip then married a French princess, then an Austrian cousin. He just kept marrying, and the chin kept getting passed down like a terrible family heirloom. By the time we get back to our friend Charles II, the genetic cul-de-sac was complete. An autopsy performed on Charles II stated that his body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. Now, 17th century autopsies are not exactly peer-reviewed science. A heart the size of a peppercorn is physically impossible. But the descriptions convey the horror the doctors felt. They looked inside this man and saw a biological disaster. The sad part is Charles knew something was wrong. Near the end, he was depressed and terrified. He believed he was rotting from the inside out, which, to be fair, he kind of was. He died at 38, looking like an old man of 80, and with him the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs vanished. They had married themselves out of existence. It's a lesson in moderation, really. Moderation in conquest and moderation in keeping it in the family. But the Habsburgs weren't the only ones with eccentricities. If we float north across the gray waters of the English Channel into the misty lands of Scotland and England, we find the Stuarts. Ah, the Stuarts. If the Habsburgs were physically broken, the Stuarts were emotionally chaotic. They had a knack for bad luck and worse decision-making. Let's talk about James I and 6th of Scotland. He took over after Elizabeth I died. He was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, James was a smart guy. They called him the wisest fool in Christendom. He wrote books on politics. He wrote books on witches. He hated them. He wrote books on tobacco. He hated that too. James had some personal quirks. He was terrified of assassination. Understandable, given that his father was murdered and his mother was executed. But James took it to extremes. He wore padded doublets, essentially proto-bulletproof vests stuffed with wool and cotton, so that dagger thrusts wouldn't penetrate. This made him look huge and lumpy. He waddled around the palace like a heavily armored pillow.
He also reportedly never washed, or at least he washed very rarely. He thought water was bad for his health. A courtier noted that his skin was as soft as taffeta sarcenet, which sounds nice until you realize it was because he never scrubbed it. He just rubbed his fingers in wet napkins occasionally. James was also incredibly socially awkward. He had a tongue that was slightly too large, a royal trend apparently, so he spluttered when he drank. He was prone to fawning over his favorites, young, handsome men at court, like the Duke of Buckingham. He would write them letters calling them his sweet child and wife, and sign them your dad and husband, which is a lot. Historians have argued for centuries about the nature of these relationships, but let's just say James was a man who needed a lot of emotional support. And then there was his son, Charles I. Oh, Charles, the man who looked at the rising tide of democracy and said, "No thanks, I'm appointed by God." Charles I was small, stuttered, and had a resting face that looked essentially tragic. You know those Van Dyke portraits? He always looks like he just dropped his ice cream. He had an absolute belief in the divine right of kings. He genuinely thought he could do whatever he wanted. Parliament disagreed. They fought a civil war about it. It didn't end well for Charles. But we're not here for the war. We're here for the personal weirdness. Charles was obsessed with decorum. Even when he was a prisoner of the parliamentarians, he insisted on being served his meals on bended knee. He was living in a drafty castle, stripped of his power, waiting to be put on trial for treason, but he still required his few remaining servants to treat him like a deity. On the day of his execution, it was freezing cold, January 1649. Charles asked for 2 shirts, not for fashion, but for something else. He didn't want to shiver from the cold. He was afraid the crowd would see him shivering and think he was trembling with fear. "I would have no such imputation," he said. "I fear not death. Death is not terrible to me. I bless my God I am prepared." So he put on the extra shirt, walked out onto the scaffold, gave a little speech that nobody could hear because of the wind and the soldiers, and then, well, the axe fell. It's a heavy moment, but let's lighten it up a bit by looking at what happened to his head afterwards, because history doesn't stop at death. They sewed it back on, roughly. They embalmed him and stuck him in a vault with Henry VIII. Flash forward to 1813. Workmen are fixing up the royal vault at Windsor. They stumble across a coffin. They open it, and there is Charles I. The Prince Regent, later George IV, was there. He was a curious guy. He decided to take a look. The doctor present, Sir Henry Halford, actually cut off a piece of Charles's vertebrae and stole it. He used it as a salt shaker at dinner parties. I'm not making this up. For years, people would go to dinner at the Halford house, and he would bring out a little bone and say, "This is the king's neck bone." Queen Victoria eventually heard about this and was understandably horrified. She made him give it back, so the bone was returned to the grave. But for a brief shining moment, a piece of a decapitated king was a centerpiece at Victorian dinner parties.
Tycho's own death was just as strange, and again related to social etiquette. In 1601, he was attending a banquet in Prague. The wine was flowing. Tycho needed to use the bathroom, badly. But etiquette dictated that you could not leave the table before the host did, and the host was just sitting there, talking and drinking. Tycho was too polite to excuse himself. He held it, and held it, and held it. By the time he got home, the damage was done. His bladder had been stretched to the point of no return. He developed a severe infection, or uremia. He spent the next 11 days in agony, unable to urinate, before finally dying. On his deathbed, he kept repeating, "Let me not seem to have lived in vain." He didn't live in vain. His data allowed Johannes Kepler, who was his assistant, to figure out the laws of planetary motion. But he did die in vain. He died because he was too polite to pee. There is a lesson there for all of us. If you have to go, just go. Don't die for a dinner party. Let's leave Tycho and his golden nose. Let's drift forward in time again. We're going to the 19th century, to America,
to a man who declared himself Emperor of the United States. His name was Joshua Norton, and he is one of the most delightful figures in history. Norton was an English immigrant who lived in San Francisco during the gold rush. He was a businessman. He made a fortune in real estate, but then he lost it all in a bad deal involving rice. He tried to corner the rice market, but then a ship full of rice showed up from Peru and the price crashed. Norton went bankrupt. He disappeared for a while. When he came back in 1859, he was different. He walked into the office of the San Francisco Bulletin and handed the editor a proclamation. It began, "At the peremptory request and desire of a large majority of the citizens of these United States, I, Joshua Norton, declare and proclaim myself Emperor of these United States." The editor, presumably having a slow news day, printed it, and San Francisco just went with it. They didn't lock him up, they didn't mock him, they adopted him. Norton wore an old military uniform with gold epaulets that someone had given him. He wore a beaver hat with a peacock feather. He carried a cane and a saber. He walked the streets of San Francisco, inspecting the sidewalks and checking on the police officers. The police officers saluted him. If they didn't, they got in trouble. He issued proclamations. Some of them were crazy. He fired Abraham Lincoln. It didn't take. He ordered the dissolution of Congress. Congress ignored him. He ordered the army to clear the halls of Congress. The army was busy. But some of his ideas were visionary. He ordered that a bridge be built between San Francisco and Oakland. Everyone laughed. A bridge across the bay? Impossible. Years later, the Bay Bridge was built exactly where he said it should be. He printed his own money, Norton bonds. They were small notes, 50 cents or $1. He would use them to pay for his meals at restaurants, and the restaurants accepted them. They would hang the notes in the window by appointment to His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Norton I. It was good for business. He was poor, technically. He lived in a boarding house, but he ate at the best tables in the city for free. He had the best seat at the opening night of the opera reserved for him. When his uniform got too shabby, the city council of San Francisco voted to buy him a new one with taxpayer money. Norton sent them a gracious thank you note. He also had 2 dogs, Bummer and Lazarus. They were stray mongrels who followed him everywhere. They were famous in their own right. When Lazarus died, the newspapers ran a front-page obituary. Norton ruled for 21 years. When he died in 1880 on the street, collapsing on his way to a lecture, the city went into mourning. The headline read, "Le roi est mort." The king is dead. 30,000 people attended his funeral. The funeral procession was 2 miles long. Rich, poor, businessmen, laborers, they all came to say goodbye to the crazy man who thought he was an emperor. Because, in a way, he was. He created a reality, and everyone just agreed to live in it with him because it was more fun than the real world. He was a benevolent dictator of vibes. There is something very comforting about Emperor Norton, the idea that you can just decide to be important, and if you're kind enough and strange enough, the world might just let you. Let's leave Tycho and his golden nose. Let's drift forward in time again. We're going to the 19th century, to France, to the court of the Sun King, Louis XIV. We've talked about weird biology, we've talked about strange deaths. Now we need to talk about strange jobs. Because if you were a noble in Versailles, you didn't work, you served. And service often meant watching the king do very private things. We need to talk about the groom of the stool. But first, let's set the scene. Versailles is gold, its mirrors, its fountains. It is the most beautiful palace on earth. It also smelled terrible. We'll get into the olfactory challenges of the French court in just a moment. The king's fistula and the woman who loved a corpse. So, Versailles. When you see it in movies, it's all silk gowns, powdered wigs, and polite dancing. It looks pristine. But if you could smell a movie, you would turn that TV off immediately. Versailles was built on a swamp. The plumbing was non-existent. There were thousands of people living there, nobles, servants, soldiers, and almost no toilets. People relieved themselves in the hallways, behind curtains, in the gardens. The smell was described by visitors as the stench of a carcass. To combat this, the French invented the heavy use of perfume. They weren't just trying to smell nice, they were trying to create a chemical barrier between their noses and the reality of the palace. Men and women carried pomanders, balls of scented wax or herbs, and held them to their noses constantly. It was an olfactory war zone. But for the nobles, the lack of hygiene was secondary to the pursuit of status. And status in Versailles was defined by how close you could get to the king's body. Every morning, the Sun King, Louis XIV, performed the lever, the rising. It wasn't just a guy waking up and brushing his teeth. It was a theatrical performance. The king would wake up, the curtains would be drawn back, and a room full of people would watch him. But not just anyone. You had to be a very high-ranking noble to be in the room. There was a strict hierarchy. The grande entrée admitted the most elite, then the première entrée. The highest honor was to be the one to hand the king his shirt. Imagine that. You are a duke. Your ancestors got punched by Joan of Arc, and your big day is when you get to hand the king his shirt, before all the other guys who aren't allowed to hand the king his shirt. But even higher than that, the groom of the stool. We'll get into the exact responsibilities of this prestigious post in just a second. But first, some newslets.
You see these photos in antique shops sometimes. A mother holding a baby. The mother looks stiff, trying to hold perfectly still for the long exposure. The baby looks peaceful. Too peaceful. It seems gruesome to us. Why would you want a photo of a corpse? But for them, it was an act of love. It was the only image they would ever have of that person. It was a way to freeze time in an era where death was everywhere. Tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid. Death was a roommate. You had to make friends with it. There were even guidebooks on how to pose the dead. Arrange the limbs naturally. Place a favorite toy nearby. It was a whole industry. And speaking of industry, let's talk about the Victorian obsession with what they put inside their bodies while they were still alive. Because the quest for the perfect body is not a modern invention. The Victorians were just as neurotic about their weight as we are. They just had significantly worse science to deal with it. Let's talk about the tapeworm diet. Yes, that is exactly what it sounds like. The ideal Victorian woman was supposed to be frail, pale, a delicate flower, a waist you could encircle with 2 hands. But rich Victorian food was heavy, meat pies, puddings, creams. So how do you eat the pudding but keep the waist? Parasites. Advertisements, sketchy ones, usually in the back of magazines, would sell pills containing the cyst of a tapeworm. The logic was simple. You swallow the pill, the worm hatches in your stomach, it eats your food for you, you lose weight without having to stop eating cake. It's genius in a horrific way. It's essentially outsourcing your digestion to a monster living in your intestines. The side effects were predictably unpleasant: nausea, abdominal pain, vitamin deficiencies. And then, once you reached your target weight, you had the problem of evicting the tenant. Getting rid of the tapeworm was an ordeal. Doctors prescribed all sorts of poisons to kill it. Or there was a device, a literal trap that you were supposed to swallow. It was a small metal cylinder baited with food. The idea was the worm would stick its head in the cylinder to get the food, and a spring-loaded trap would snap shut on its neck. Then you would pull the cylinder and the worm out by a string. I want you to really visualize that for a second. Sitting in a Victorian parlor, swallowing a metal trap on a string, fishing for a parasite in your own stomach, and you thought your juice cleanse was annoying. Of course, many of these tapeworm pills were scams. They were just placebo pills.
which is actually the best-case scenario. You got ripped off, but at least you didn't have a 30-foot worm named Nigel living in your colon. But the Victorians didn't stop at worms. They loved poison. They loved it. Arsenic was everywhere. It was in the wallpaper. It was in the green dye used for dresses. And it was in the face cream. Arsenic complexion wafers were a real beauty product. They promised to remove freckles, pimples, and facial grossness. The idea was that small doses of arsenic would kill off the red blood cells, making your skin look pale and translucent, the consumptive chic look. Looking like you were dying of tuberculosis was very fashionable. So women were literally microdosing poison to look paler. It worked, in a sense. Arsenic accumulates in the system. It gives you a certain glow before it eventually shuts down your organs. It also makes your hair fall out and causes vomiting, which are less desirable beauty traits. But fashion is pain, right? They also put belladonna in their eyes. Belladonna, or deadly nightshade. It's a toxic plant. But if you drop a little extract into your eye, it paralyzes the muscles of the iris, forcing the pupil to dilate. Why would you want that? Because big pupils were considered attractive. They made you look aroused or innocent or just dreamy. It gave you that doe-eyed look. The downside was that it made your vision blurry, and if you used it too much, it could cause permanent blindness. But hey, who needs to see when your eyes look this deep and mysterious? You could just stumble around the ballroom, bumping into furniture, looking absolutely gorgeous and completely blind. Let's leave the Victorian vanity table with its poison creams and worm pills. Let's float forward a bit into the 20th century. We're going to talk about a man who had everything: money, power, madness. We are going to talk about Howard Hughes. But not the dashing aviator Howard Hughes, not the movie producer. We're going to talk about the Howard Hughes who sat naked in a hotel room for months, watching the same movie 150 times in a row, terrified of dust. It's a story of a different kind of royalty, American royalty, and it's just as inbred and strange as anything the Habsburgs could come up with. But instead of a large jaw, the symptom was a complete detachment from reality, fueled by unlimited wealth. Howard Hughes was the richest man in the world. He was handsome. He dated Ava Gardner and Katharine Hepburn. He built the fastest planes. He owned an airline. He was the Tony Stark of his day. But inside, the gears were grinding. He had OCD before anyone really knew how to treat it. He was terrified of germs. He believed that germs came from the outside world, so he had to seal himself off. In 1947, he locked himself in a screening room for 4 months. He didn't leave. He survived on chocolate bars, chicken, and milk. He relieved himself in empty milk bottles, which he then lined up in neat rows. He stopped bathing. He stopped cutting his nails, and he watched movies. Specifically, he watched the movie Ice Station Zebra over and over and over again. He reportedly watched it 150 times on a loop. Imagine that. The sound of the submarine sonar, the icy wind playing on repeat in a dark, foul-smelling room while a billionaire sits there, naked, with uncut nails curling around his fingers like talons. Why Ice Station Zebra? Who knows? Maybe the cold, sterile environment of the Arctic appealed to him. No germs in the ice, just clean, white death. Later in life, he moved into the Desert Inn in Las Vegas. He rented the entire top floor. When the owners asked him to leave because they needed the rooms for high rollers, he just bought the hotel. "I'll take the hotel, thanks, and the one across the street, just in case the neon sign bothers me." He lived there for years, a phantom in his own life. He had a crew of Mormon aides. He hired Mormons because they didn't drink or smoke, who had to follow strict rituals. If they handed him a spoon, they had to wrap the handle in tissue paper. If they opened a door, they had to use a fresh paper towel. He wrote memos, thousands of memos, detailed instructions on how to open a can of peaches. The equipment to be used in this operation consists of 1 unopened can of fruit, 2 1 sterile knife. It went on for pages. If the aide did it wrong, Hughes would throw the peaches away and start over. It's tragic, really. A mind capable of designing advanced aircraft, now entirely focused on the structural integrity of a peach can. He died in 1976 on an airplane, en route to a hospital. When he died, he was so emaciated and unrecognizable that the FBI had to use fingerprints to identify him. The man who was once the most photographed celebrity in America had become a ghost in his own life.